Did you ever watch when people are interviewed on the TV and they say, well, what are you thankful for? They say, oh, I'm thankful for my job. I'm thankful for my house. I'm thankful for my car. Honestly, in my life, I've never heard anybody say, I'm thankful to God. I've never heard that. Maybe you have. It says in Numbers 12:3 that Moses was the most meek man on the face of the earth at that time. First time I ever read that, I had trouble with it. Moses was a leader of millions of people. He confronted a dictator, arguably the most powerful dictator in the world at that time. And I've considered myself standing in front of a dictator. Maybe Idi Amin, he only killed 500,000 of his own. Or Fidel Castro, who killed about 700,000. Or maybe Joe Stalin or Mao Zedong, who killed about 50 million of their own apiece. It astounds me to even consider it. Moses stood up to the ones who challenged him. He had seen God in person. God called him his friend. So why would God call him meek? The title of the day is Meekness and Thanksgiving, or if you like, Thanksgiving and Meekness. They go together. I'll give you the benefit first. Benefit is that meekness is listed in Galatians 5:23 as part of the fruit of God's Spirit. The purpose is to see how God associates meekness with thanksgiving. When Moses' mother, Jochebed, was pregnant, the edict went out from the dictator to kill all the Hebrew male babies. And the task was assigned to the midwives. Well, to their credit, they didn't do it. So Pharaoh says, I'll take care of that. Through a little bit of trickery, as we know, Moses was spared. God had a great purpose in mind for him. The first 3 years of his life, his mother was with him, but after that, we don't really hear about him much for 37 more years, total of 40. But I just got a hunch, having been raised in the household of a dictator, that he wasn't raised according to the Deuteronomy 6 program. We have that available today, but I don't think he learned much about that where he was. I just got a hunch. It was one thing that I have learned from watching people in my life, is that most of the time, children seem to inherit an awful lot of the mindset, the thinking, the traits of their parents. And to their credit, sometimes they cast off the bad traits, but sometimes they carry over also. I'd like to start by turning to Acts 7, please. I'm making the assumption that the Egyptian palace wasn't a good place to learn meekness. That's just my assumption. Acts 7, this is Stephen testifying, and he says in verse 22 of Acts chapter 7, he says, Moses was educated, Acts 7:22, in all the learning of the Egyptians he was a man of power and a word of deeds. But when he was approaching the age of 40, it entered his mind to visit his brethren, the sons of Israel. Did you ever have a thought come into your mind and you wondered where it came from? About 7 or 8 years ago, I started having thoughts sometimes in the middle of the night. And I'd forget what they were in the morning. So I put a piece of paper and a pen on the table next to my bed. I was talking on the phone to Larry Wonderland a few years back, and I mentioned that, and he said the same thing happened to him, and so he does the same thing. So I knew it wasn't just me. Well, we know what happened. He visited his brethren. One of his brethren was being abused, so he says, I'll take care of this, and he murdered the man who was abusing him. And then he ran away because he was afraid he'd be killed himself. And he went to a place called Midian, and I'd like to look at Exodus 2:21 because it says something there that's very interesting. Exodus 2, verse 21. A simple statement. He met a man by the name of Jethro, and he says, Moses was content to live with the man, and he gave Zipporah his daughter to Moses. Okay, he was content. I think the Living Bible says he became content. And I've been there, so I can attest to that. Which is to say, when I was young, I had a pretty good job. And then I got a job that wasn't so good, and I wasn't content at first, but I became content. Donna and I have been watching a series lately on television because it was recommended by Mr. Melvin Rhodes, simply called The Crown. And it is, in essence, the story of the life and required behavior of Queen Elizabeth and those around her. But one of the things that really has struck me about the show, besides what I'm seeing from learning of the behavior patterns, is the luxury in which they live. New, big, expensive cars, beautiful clothing, jewelry, and the walls in the rooms are 20 feet high with woodwork that's so ornate that the average person couldn't even consider it. Well, that's what Moses was used to. Now he's living in a tent, taking care of sheep. So I got a hunch that content didn't happen all at once. I got a hunch that he learned that. Well, again, we don't hear what happens to him for another 40 years, but I can say this. Jethro was not a son of Jacob, but he was a son of Isaac. And he's called a priest of Midian, and he had another name that was given to him by the locals. It was Reuel, which I suppose is pronounced something like Ruel. And Ruel means God is his friend. God is his friend. And I just have a hunch that in the next 40 years, Moses learned some things that were different than he learned in the first 40 years. Let's take a look at Exodus 4 and check on verse 10, please. Exodus 4:10. God is talking to Moses now in this bush that's on fire but not being consumed. And Moses replies to what God has said by saying, in verse 10, Moses said to the Lord, O my Lord, I have never been eloquent, neither in the past nor even now. You have spoken to your servant, but I am slow of speech and slow of tongue. Okay, looking back to Acts chapter 7, you don't have to turn there. Stephen said he was mighty in words and deeds. Josephus said he was an orator. The New Living Translation says he was an orator. I got a hunch that 40 years earlier he might have said something different to God. The word meek is not popular anymore in the newer translations. It's been replaced with gentle in a lot of cases. But there's a difference. Gentleness refers mostly to the physical. Meekness is what's in here and what's up here. Meekness can lead to gentleness, but usually the other doesn't take place. Moses' outlook had completely changed. I think he realized in the last 40 years that it wasn't all about him. When I read about Moses, I never read of him saying to the Pharaoh that he was a great leader. I never read of him saying to Korah that he was a great leader. I never read of him saying to Miriam and Aaron that he was a good leader. I do remember that he interceded for them. I remember when God was going to kill all the people of Israel, how Moses interceded for them. It was as though he was more concerned with the people who had been put under his authority, much like perhaps a good shepherd would be concerned about the sheep who are under him. Let's take a look at 1 Corinthians, please, 15. 1 Corinthians 15, verse 10. Tremendous responsibility and honor had been given to Moses because of the meekness that he had learned. And I suspect he learned it in the second 40 years of his life. In 1 Corinthians 15:10, we read a statement by a man who also learned meekness. 1 Corinthians 15, verse 10, But by the grace of God I am what I am, and his grace toward me has not been in vain. On the contrary, I worked harder than any of them, though it was not I, but the grace of God that is in me. Paul could see that it was not him that was doing the work. I can remember Herbert Armstrong years ago saying time and time again, I am not the leader of the Church of God. Jesus Christ is the leader of the Church of God. As an aside, meekness does not mean that we cannot speak the truth with power and boldness. Stephen did, Paul did. Brethren, God has a plan for all of us. I suspect we can all look back and see the hand of God in our life even since before we were called. It's tough to just become meek. God has to do that for us. I'd like to close by turning to 1 Peter 5. At Thanksgiving time, I think it's good to understand that true thanksgiving has a lot to do with meekness. 1 Peter 5, verse 6, one statement. Peter writes, "Therefore, humble yourself under the mighty hand of God, that he may exalt you in due time."